Alright, so you guys know what's up. On Sunday, Carlos Alcaraz completed what was comfortably the youngest ever career Grand Slam, beating out a prior Nadal record for the youngest career slam that also had the next up in terms of age beat out quite comfortably. And with that, 7 total Grand Slams at just the age of 22, increases his hold as the world's number one right now, and you would have to say for the foreseeable future, he holds the title right now as heavyweight champion of the world. Obviously, big picture in historical contexts. Honestly, you could tell before now that the sky was the limit, but that goes without saying. And I think in the now, you can safely say that I would put that line of demarcation being post-Wimbledon last year, that Carlos Alcaraz has firmly, I think, entered his prime. And what a difference a year makes, because you take it back this time a year ago, and what a miserable existence it must be still holding 2 out of the 4 slams this time a year ago, and being able to call that sort of rock bottom and in the trenches relative to what had been like a skyrocket and seamless run for Alcaraz out of the gates since he broke through at the 2021 US Open. But obviously, in the aftermath of that heartbreaking gold medal match loss, it had really been the only sort of extended period of a choppy 6 months for Alcaraz. End of August 2024 through to March of 2025, and you could argue even through Monte Carlo of 2025, he still hadn't played his best, save the Beijing tournament in 2024 for a long, long time. But of course, winning ugly there did seem to set him back right mentally. And listen, I mean, talent is talent, and in one as monstrous as Alcaraz, he wasn't going to stay down on the mat for long. Especially a talent who, from the moment that he has stepped on tour, we have known is made of the right stuff mentally, one of the most dogged competitors, etc., etc. Realistically, it was a matter of when, not if, he'd be back to winning ways. But specifically, you could tell right then and there how huge it was scraping through that quarterfinal, the great escape against Arthur Fils, and he hasn't looked back since. And since then, it has been a borderline dynastic run, and because I don't really have all that much to say about this Australian Open final, because the story, more or less watching the match, you could tell this was a match where youth won out. Simply put, Alcaraz looked like the guy over 15 years Djokovic is junior, and despite the legend fighting the good fight, as you expect, Carlos Alcaraz won that match playing very much within himself, using his variety first and foremost, and then later using his youth to work away at the legs and sap the energy of a Novak Djokovic that had already thrown his best punch and was feeling the heat of being on the second leg of this gauntlet that you have to run inevitably to win one of these majors, of having to go through, in all likelihood, both Sinner and Alcaraz, in addition to his age. But reading into just how the match broke down, how the match unfolded, and really Alcaraz's entire road through the 2026 Australian Open, while he himself, during the event, told us that I don't think I'm playing quite as well as the US Open, I thought in many ways it was equally impressive and, even more importantly to me, equally demonstrative of Alcaraz's growth since August of last year. If the US Open last year was the statement of the high-end talent and the culmination of all these improvements and tweaks to his game he had made from the jump in 2025, and boy, did it look scary. One of the most dominant US Open slam runs, period, you would have to say, in modern tennis history. But if that was the glorious high-end talent firing on all cylinders, this year's Australian Open was demonstrative of how drastically Alcaraz has raised his floor, courtesy of really, again, all those improvements that I've really hammered on with my end of 2025 video, as well as talking about the lead up to the semifinals as well. But also what stood out was the showcase, I think, of how much Carlos has grown mentally and just how mature a performance this entire tournament was. You start off, and like the US Open a year ago, in contrast to a lot of Alcaraz's slam winning runs and slam runs in general prior, he continued to be efficient, continued to just take care of business without wasting time, spending more time on court than he needed to, giving away some cheap sets. Something that you would say, Wimbledon 2023 aside, was sort of a trademark prior to this evolution. And it was telling of a big picture, just streakiness in Alcaraz, where if he went on a mental walkabout, you could get streakiness within matches. Of course, within the calendar, getting like a bad month here or there of scratchier play. And of course, it's tennis, it happens. There will be like ebbs and flows mentally with focus, and now his game just seems so much more bankable, where even when that walkabout happens, his game is just more bulletproof fundamentally to it. When the serve can pick up some slack, when he's harder to rush, etc., etc. And then again, the Zverev match in the semifinals, I didn't get to talk about that one. I honed more in on the second semi. But the way that he managed that match, potentially a sliding doors moment with how well he was able to deal with his body seizing up on him. I mean, to begin with, again, like, he and Sasha, I felt both were pretty tense throughout most of the first two sets. And yeah, in prior years, you talk about matches like that, how Alcaraz came out nervous in the 23 French, the 23 Wimbledon matches, the 22 Roland Garros, 24 Aussie Open matches against Zverev as well. Underratedly, actually, the one 5-set match he's ever lost to Matteo Berrettini, and I know he was very, very green still in his ascent, but all these are matches where if he wasn't off to a flyer out of the gates, it could compound on itself and dig him an early hole. And I felt there was quite a bit of tension in the early going in that Zverev match, his first Aussie Open semifinal to that point. So, understandable, but even through that all, he still found a way to keep his nose out in front. He built a 2-set to love lead, and despite a largely tight performance, looked to be barreling towards a straight, potentially worst-case scenario, relatively stress-free 4-set win. And to this point, I have seen enough with Carlos as far as the endurance stuff, as far as conditioning, that I do feel like the cramps would have happened as a result of tension, especially because it had only been through the opening 2 sets of the match. I know it was a lengthy first 2 sets. In the day conditions, perhaps heat played a factor there. Of course, he was sick also at the beginning of the 3rd set. But I kind of just got the inkling that those cramps happened, and I could be wrong, but more so as a result of the stress combined with the physical exertions. But once we got there, I mean, what poise on show by the 22-year-old, and how huge was the cushion that he built in the first place. Just an amazing job of, like, biding his time. And low-key also just what a flexing of talent, because even through the large portions, end of the 3rd, through most of the 4th set, where the movement was shot, you know how good you have to be able to just pull off, like, teeing off on all these forehands, improvising when coming in, or drop-shotting to shorten points that way, to the extent where you made Zverev win 2 tie breaks. And early in the 4th, like, I know in the 4th there were a couple of, like, love 30s and looks for Zverev throughout the set to break earlier, but how key did that end up being? Because I think one of the earlier Love 30s, I was kind of thinking to myself, maybe you tank this fourth set. But who knows? If he does, maybe he doesn't give himself enough time to recoup. Maybe that's not enough time for the pickle juice, the electrolytes to take action and to get his legs back underneath him. But you could feel the scales tipping as early as the end of the fourth set as far as who was going to be fresher the longer this went. Ultimately, I was surprised because a lot of the breakpoint looks that Alcaraz had after going down a break early in the fifth were pretty shocking misses, especially coming off the Alcaraz forehand. That in tandem, whereas Zverev, to be fair, did a tremendous job holding Alcaraz off until he couldn't anymore. And, the guy has put his fighting qualities and clutchness on full display. That's been one of the hallmarks of him since he popped up onto the scene. All those misses on break points throughout the course of the set, none of it mattered. You kind of still felt it was inevitable with Zverev serving for it at 5-4. And once it happened, that was pretty much all she wrote, at which point the scales had completely tipped for Alcaraz as far as who had more left to dash to the finish line. And yeah, the clock read 5.5 hours, but I think most of us had the inclination that it was still going to be harder for Djokovic to bounce back, 39 years of age. Even with the breaks he caught during this tournament to keep him fresh, it was still going to be harder for him to bounce back from 5 high-octane sets over 4+ hours with Sinner than it was going to be for the 22-year-old Alcaraz, who his first Grand Slam title was literally winning the slam with the most amount of time spent on court ever. Won back-to-back 5-setters at Roland Garros 2024. Won, I think, the second longest slam final ever at Roland Garros last year, etc., etc. To me, that mileage was going to be a non-factor. But from the semifinal, that's just what stood out to me. I thought it was a tremendous job of just keeping composure. And in a way, so was this final. I felt even at the semifinals of the US Open last year, and that was against a significantly worse version of Novak, that if anyone still intimidates Alcaraz a little bit, if there is still a challenging, mental matchup for him, it is still Djokovic. That semifinal, to me, felt like far and away the worst match Alcaraz placed throughout the course of that magical US Open run. There honestly was a window there for Novak to get back into that one in the second set when he broke. But even then, as opposed to how he dealt with the specter of Djokovic in Australia in 2025, he got back on the wagon, he stayed the course, he did not let that snowball on him the way that he did in Australia last year, where I just kind of felt like he stayed in this sort of mental fog of not really knowing the best way to go about dealing with the injury issues on the other side of the net until it was a little too late. And again, that could have happened here. Djokovic played one of the great sets he's played really in recent memory, and on that court, going down a set to the 10-time champion, feel like there was all the opportunity in the world to panic a little, or at least want to respond in a way more synonymous with how Carlos loves to win. You've kind of been led into his head where it's ideally I want to put on a great show for the fans, pull off all these spectacular shots, and I feel like in the past there was a chance there, obviously, that Alcaraz tries to sort of one-up in redlining what Djokovic did in that first set, but the way that he responded then and through the rest of the match really was indicative of an approach that was let's just hang around and wait for a dip. Chances are there's no way he's going to be able to maintain what he did in the first set the rest of the match. And yeah, once he got his teeth into the match, it really was just battening down the hatches the rest of the way. Like, I talked about Djokovic's risk profile being, like, way up in the Musetti match and the timing not being there. That didn't really change in the next two matches. Like, it was still as ball-bashy as it can get from Novak. And, yeah, I mean, something that he just has to do in this body. But the timing was much, much better in those subsequent two matches. And I do suspect a good deal of that was being on at night. I touched on that a little bit during my semifinal preview, that I thought it would probably help both. I know it was made a lot about how it would help with Sinner's cramping during the day being under a magnifying glass. But at the end of the day, like, you think about it, Djokovic's night losses on Rod Laver Arena, there's really only been one where he was healthy against Wawrinka in 2014. Otherwise, it's like super early, probably against Federer in the round of 16 in 07, in 2010. The body just kind of broke down on him in a match he was in control of, 2-1 up against Tsonga. 2018 against Hyun Chung, he comes back trying to see if, the elbow can work itself out without getting surgery. Comes to find out that he does need it to fix the elbow. And so, yeah, bottom line, these are his Goldilocks conditions. Rod Laver Arena at night, he just doesn't lose. And that made for just a lot better ball striking showings to end this tournament. But I feel like Alcaraz recognized that that was really the only path Djokovic was going to take here, because there's just not really an option there for him to rely on defense as much. Especially not with an already sort of worn down gas tank after the semifinal. And yeah, his level never quite hit the highs of set 1, and you could feel almost immediately early in set 2 that his level sort of nosedived. Carlos sort of offered up a chance after he got the break initially early in the second, but Novak not being able to take that, you could kind of tell after that, unless like Alcaraz gifted him a look back in the set, that he was kind of just going to punt on set number 2. Again, that made the beginning of set number 3 super, super important, because the way in which like Novak threw that second set, it didn't really allow for that much rhythm being built. But again, I think Carlos just recognized like how Novak was going to have to play. He defended when he needed to. That's really where the spectacular shots from Alcaraz in this match came, with some crazy scramble drills, some great shots on the run. That, and what really stood out in comparison to playing Sinner in the semifinals, the defending, the variety, and actually in the third what really stood out was like his ability to stretch the court with width. I'm talking like 1-2, 30 all, and then the shot he hit to break, I believe, at 2 all, both cross-court forehands, where he didn't retreat back, kind of just took the ball early for some short-angle cross-court forehands that sent Djokovic outside the tram lines. It all just exploited, where this version of Djokovic can be got. Novak obviously does a tremendous job of like hiding it, but yeah, there was no hiding here. I mean, Alcaraz, he just went at the like diminished rally tolerance, the diminished endurance, probably more in this final than he actually did going at the diminished like movement and trying to get on the offensive. And of course, you talk about the point of this match, the first point of that 1-2 game in the third set. Every single shot was awesome. I mean, the return from Djokovic on the stretch was amazing, landing just inside the baseline. Alcaraz, again, this version of him with that compacted forehand, backhand, just so much less rushable, hits an unreal, like, half-volley approach to redirect that bullet of a return. Unreal Djokovic get, where Alcaraz not taking this ball out of the air sort of made it pretty awkward, and he did a great job of like sort of just dinking and rolling his wrist for a short angle backhand. Djokovic rocketing that ball on the run around the net post, And Alcaraz, ever the great tennis instincts, retreating back, anticipating where it's going, and stabbing it right into the open court. Unbelievable point. And yeah, again, like, the spectacular from Carlos in this match was mostly defending. Another similarly great scramble drill at 4-2 and then 5-3. Alcaraz Djokovic have really played a couple of like really notably lengthy service games on Djokovic's serve. This really reminded me of that game in the third set of the Wimbledon final in 23 where, you know, he just kind of hung around in the game long enough. Even though this one was love 40 to begin with, even if not premeditated, it just seemed like this game went on and on just to make Novak all the more weary. And yeah, he was winded. And yeah, at 2-1, obviously Djokovic had pulled the impossible in this tournament already, but it still felt like a long road back. And you were starting to get the feeling that with Alcaraz settling into this match, all Djokovic was really going to be able to do, even if you knew that with one more set to keep his hopes alive here for 25, it was probably going to be the hardest set for Alcaraz to win. It still felt like all he was going to be able to do here was just fight the good fight. Like, it clearly felt like Alcaraz had taken the reins in this match. And to Novak's credit, yeah, he absolutely fought the good fight. I mean, 6 break points saved in the first game of the fourth, and only one of them really was a gift from Carlos. But other than that, rest of the way, it just continued like normal service. Djokovic fighting to hold on, Alcaraz not blinking. For all, Djokovic plays some tremendous defense, hits a great return to set up the one break point at 4-all, 30-40. Expensive miss on break point, you would have to say, but given all the circumstances, it kind of felt like Alcaraz imposed like pressing miss just because the legs were running on empty and Alcaraz had pretty much shut him out in the last 3 sets. I believe didn't even give Novak a look after the early break back look Djokovic had in the second set very early on. And after that, it would be no different. He slammed the door shut. The first point of the 5-6 game, serving again to stay in it. Alcaraz again went to work on the Djokovic legs by virtue of just absorbing every single blow until Djokovic missed. And that was kind of all she wrote. It felt like that took enough out of Novak. He played sort of a tired last game. I will say on his part, like, I can't gush any more than I did about that semifinal win. And I said in that video, like, this should legitimately be sustenance on the Djokovic end. Really not only for the rest of this year, but it should be part and parcel, really, with his tennis imprint for the rest of time. That center win alone genuinely feels like, to me, should be as iconic as, like, 39-year-old Jimmy Connors' feat of making the 91 US Open semis. And I wasn't even alive for that. That's nearly a decade preceding me, and I know that moment. I feel like that's how this Djokovic Australian Open run should be viewed. Truly like a transcendent time capsule moment. And again, he fought the good fight. Even in this final, reality of being a 39-year-old almost just basically caught up to him in this one. But regardless of where we go from here, you gotta tip your cap to this guy's exploits this past fortnight in Australia. And it ends on what might be the best speech ever from the king of being gracious in defeat. But on the flip side, ending on Carlos Alcaraz, it feels like it's his time right now. This match feels a little extra significant, even outside of what was on the line for him historically, just because it felt like he played it in a manner where he just understood, I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to be at my very best. I just gotta be better than the guy on the other side of the net. And yeah, when those smarts, that maturity comes about in conjunction with all these improvements in his game, I mean, yeah, you better watch out. If you remember, end of 2024, the noise was pretty loud. And back then, I was like, so what? Maybe this is just who he is. Maybe Alcaraz is bound to just have a couple bad months per season. Maybe this streakiness is just part of who he is. And I'm telling you, like, he came out of the box probably the most complete young player ever. He could have, like, marginally improved the rest of his career from who he was 2022 to 2024, having this, like, absurd skill set plus already being one of the best big match performers and clutchest players when the chips are down that we have ever seen. And have your frustrations as you may, that guy was still probably going to have an all-time great career. But that guy, now in very short order, leveling up to this, that's scary stuff, man. And right now, until further notice, I don't know that anyone has anything for him. It's your move, Yannick Sinner. The onus has been placed back onto his arch rival. And to be fair, this is where Carlos Alcaraz was after losing the Wimbledon final last year, losing one on quote-unquote his turf. And guess what? He has responded with the best version of himself ever. I closed this one out again the same way that I opened. The sky is the limit for this kid.